We've already looked at how the novel gains cultural legitimacy through the novel of manners, specifically in the works of Scott and Austen, where moral judgment is grounded in shared social norms and intelligible words. This lecture turns to the next phase in the development of the novel, Victorian realism. Here, the novel expands beyond limited social circles to address public life, institutions, and collective experience. The focus shifts from manners to society, and from moral calibration within a group to moral inquiry into the structures that shape everyday life. By the middle of the 19th century, the English novel enters a phase in which it assumes an openly public role, presenting itself not merely as a form of entertainment or private reflection, but as a medium of moral inquiry into society itself. The Victorian novel is characterized by a remarkable expansion of scope, confidence, and ambition, as fiction takes on the task of representing social institutions, collective experience, and structural injustice. Unlike earlier phases of the novel, which often focused on individual moral struggle or limited social worlds, Victorian realism treats society as a complex, interconnected system shaped by economic forces, legal structures, education, labor, and class relations. The novel becomes a way of making these structures visible and morally legible to a broad reading public. This confidence in fiction's social function reflects a belief that narrative can illuminate injustice, provoke sympathy, and foster ethical awareness. Within this framework, realism is not neutral description, but an engaged practice. It selects, shapes, and exaggerates in order to reveal social truth. The Victorian novel thus positions itself as a form of public discourse, capable of addressing collective problems and appealing to shared moral values. Charles Dickens stands at the center of this development, embodying the Victorian novel's outward turn toward public life and institutional critique. His fiction is driven by extraordinary narrative energy, populating the novel with vast cast of characters drawn from across the social spectrum. Exaggeration, caricature, and emotional intensity are not flaws in Dickens' realism, but deliberate strategies that make social realities vivid and compelling. Through this excess, Dickens exposes the cruelty and absurdity of institutions such as workhouses, schools, prisons, courts, and bureaucratic systems that claim moral authority while producing suffering. Urban life, especially the modern city, emerges as a dominant presence in his work, depicted as crowded, chaotic, oppressive, yet alive with human vitality. Dickens relies heavily on sentiment and sympathy, seeking to move readers emotionally rather than inviting detached judgment. His plots are often episodic and loosely structured, propelled by momentum rather than by formal symmetry. But this very looseness allows him to register the lived experience of social disorder. In this sense, Dickens transforms realism into a dramatic and effective mode, combining moral urgency with popular appeal. He expands both the audience and the ambition of the novel, demonstrating how fiction can function as a powerful instrument of social conscience. Alongside Dickens, but working in a markedly different register, William Makepeace Thackeray represents another major strand of Victorian moral realism. Where Dickens relies on emotional excess and imaginative force, Thackeray emphasizes restraint, irony, and narrative judgment. His novels return authority to a controlling narrative intelligence that evaluates characters and situations with critical distance. Social life is presented not as a spectacle of suffering demanding sympathy, but as a field of moral behavior requiring discernment. Thackeray's realism depends less on sentiment than on exposure. Vanity, hypocrisy, ambition, and self-deception are revealed through irony rather than emotional appeal. Narrative structure and proportion matter deeply in his work, reflecting a belief that moral understanding arises from balance, perspective, and social knowledge. Thackeray thus restores a sense of control to Victorian realism, resisting the excesses of melodrama while maintaining the novel's ethical seriousness. His fiction reinforces the idea that society can be judged, understood, and represented through disciplined narrative design. Together with Dickens, he demonstrates that the Victorian novel is not monolithic, but capable of sustaining contrasting methods while pursuing a shared moral mission. Dickens and Thackeray define a central Victorian conviction that the novel has the responsibility to address the moral life of society at large. Despite their stylistic differences, both assume that social reality is intelligible and that fiction can reveal its failures and contradictions. The Victorian novel in this phase speaks with confidence about public life, trusting in narrative's capacity to expose injustice, evaluate behavior, and engage readers in ethical reflection. This confidence distinguishes mid-Victorian realism from both earlier experimental phases and later moments of doubt and fragmentation. The novel presents itself as a forum in which private lives intersect with public systems, and where individual suffering can illuminate collective responsibility. Moral authority is not claimed abstractly, but exercised through representation, by showing how institutions shape lives and how social values are enacted or betrayed in everyday conduct. This outward-facing realism established the novel as a dominant cultural form capable of participating in public debate and moral education. At the same time, its very confidence prepares the ground for later challenges as other Victorian writers begin to question whether social narration alone can fully contain the pressures of inner life, desire, and psychological extremity. In conclusion, Victorian realism marks the novel at a moment of exceptional cultural confidence. Through Dickens and Thackeray, fiction asserts its authority to represent society, to judge institutions, and to engage readers in moral reflection. The novel becomes a public instrument capable of addressing collective life with clarity and purpose. This confidence is also a limit. The assumption that social narration can fully contain moral and psychological experience will soon be tested as later Victorian fiction turns toward inner conflict, emotional strain, and the pressures that public realism cannot easily absorb. It's from this point of strength that Victorian realism begins to fracture.